Hi everyone, welcome back. I know that my microphone is very up close and personal at this moment, but if I touch it, it will fall down. And what I can guarantee is that it is much better than hearing my voice travel around my whole apartment and come through your speakers. That I can promise you. So today I'm going to be answering your most controversial recovery questions. I did this through an anonymous submission app, so I don't know who sent these because I think sometimes people can be reticent to send through the questions they'd really like to ask because some of these conversations can be quite tough, but always important to be having these conversations, especially in this space. And you sent through over 100. There were quite a few double ups, but all really fantastic. And just some really nice messages. Sometimes doing this can open up an avenue for some pretty vile stuff to be sent through. And the last few times I've done it, that has not happened. I don't really get a lot of really bad stuff anymore, and I never got a lot of it, but just a huge show of appreciation for this community. Even as it continues to grow, you're just kind, respectful, amazing. You're just always amazing, even 10 years later. So first question, do you think recovery was easier for you because you recovered into a thin body? How can people who don't recover into a thin body maintain their recovery when society doesn't encourage their bodies? This is actually a question that I've got a lot over the years, and understandably so. And I'm going to answer it in two parts. So the first question about my recovery being easier because I recovered into a thin body. On one hand, I completely agree. It was easier. But on the other hand, it wasn't. And here's why. When any of us go into recovery, we have no idea what's going to happen. I didn't go into recovery because somebody handed me a prophecy and said, this is what will happen to your body. Your life is going to improve. Your mental health is going to improve. Your relationships will improve. You will find purpose and what you're meant to do with your life. You will have a YouTube channel where you'll connect with an amazing community. I had no idea. None of us do. Especially 10 years ago, the only representation of eating disorders was what the media was feeding us, which is what education was teaching us at the time, which is that there is only anorexia and it is only this extreme end of the stereotype. That was it. Didn't know fully recovered was a thing until 3 years in. Had no idea what this whole process looked like, took, what I would need to work on, where I was going to end up. No clue. So as much as, yes, the outcome by comparison may have been easier, none of us, when challenging the food, breaking the rules, stopping or reducing movement, all those things we have to do, there is no guarantee, certainty of what that's actually going to mean in the long run. So no, throughout the process, not easier because I had no idea genetically where I was meant to end up. I now know roughly where my body sits because it's pretty much stayed in the same range for 10 years, but didn't know that going in. But the outcome, existing in a more conventionally celebrated body, sure, without a doubt, totally agree that that makes the outcome probably easier to whatever degree, right? The second part of the question, how can people who don't recover into a thin body maintain their recovery when society doesn't encourage their bodies? Again, totally fair question. Totally agree that there is a disparity, 100%, right? I have never shied away from that, never shied away from acknowledging that I sit in that privilege, totally. The problem here is that that's when I'm concerned that people are looking at content and looking at people in the space who only sit in a certain body range, right? Because I'm aware, I follow them, they're colleagues, they're people whose work I admire, I read their books, I interview them, I promote them, I follow them. People in all kinds of bodies who have gone through the eating disorder and recovery process, who are living amazing lives, who have found incredible success, incredible self-acceptance, have beautiful relationships, have wonderful families. People who have or haven't had an eating disorder, I think it's important to seek out examples of people living incredible lives, regardless of size, ability, background, gender identity. I think that when we're going through recovery, sometimes we can sort of steer more towards the content that appeases our fears about what might happen to us through recovery. I'm probably not the right person to ask. It's kind of like asking me, Mia, what's it like to live being 5'5". I don't know. I've been 6 foot since I was 12. I probably was 5'5" at some point when I was a child. That's not genetically where I live. That's not the body I live in. That's not how I navigate the world, right? I'm not 5'5". That's not genetically where my body was meant to end up. So I can't speak to that. I can speak to how unfair it is. I can speak to how unjust it is, but I'm not going to take up that space and tell you how to navigate that, because that's not my experience, right? And what I would usually do is to sit here and give you a list of people to follow, of people's work to seek out. You can find that all over my content, but I'm not going to do that today, because I would put it to anybody who has a similar question to spend this week going and looking for examples of people who have gone through recovery or otherwise, who are in bodies which challenge this belief that only one body means happy life and one body means terrible life. Now, there are people who have been able to maintain recovery or be recovered. There are people who are doing amazing work in this space who really deserve that space and attention, and to provide that outlook and to provide that example, right? And that's what I do with clients as well. I never sit there and pretend that I can speak to every single recovery experience. That's how I teach them to expand their view and to expand their notion of what this can look like, depending on what their recovery is going to look like, and find examples that help to challenge maybe some of that narrow outlook that only eating disorder self is comfortable with. I'd love to hear your take on harm reduction in recovery. Sure, super important element of supporting people through recovery, because it comes back to that core tenet of meeting people where they are, treating each person as an individual. If somebody is only able to work on reducing harm, reducing the impact of their eating disorder, reducing whatever they can to whatever extent they can, that's amazing, because it's all relative to the person, to their context, to their comorbidities, to their support options. It's all about what that person is capable of. There is no point giving somebody a hurdle that they can't clear and making them run into it and smash themselves into it over and over again, and then be like, well, if you can't do that, then that's it. It's just therefore then about finding what is actually like the appropriate support for them. What is the appropriate approach for them? I think sometimes we can get very black and white in this space about the perfect approach, the perfect way, and therefore there are imperfect ways. And if it isn't meeting the needs of all people at all times, then it's not valuable, which to me just rings of perfectionism, as opposed to exploring a variety of avenues and keeping an open mind as to how to best match up what's available to the individual, to, if at that time, just keep them safe, then that's what the hurdle is. And if we can clear that hurdle, then do you know what? The likelihood that they can clear the next hurdle is much higher than, again, making them smash into a hurdle they can't clear. So I have said forever, different things at different times for different people. I have consults often where I figure out very quickly this person is maybe not in the action stage of recovery. Coaching is not going to be appropriate for them. And instead, in that consultation, I help them to unpack and explore what might be more appropriate avenues of support and treatment for them at the moment, rather than putting their resources and their money and their time into something that is the equivalent of smashing into that hurdle and hating the process and not wanting to do it. I will help them to seek out the supports that they actually need at this moment, because recovery can be such a mystery. Very often we think that like one thing is a replacement for another. It's like recovery coaching is not a replacement for a therapist or a dietitian. I am not a dietitian. I'm not a therapist. I cannot be those things for anyone. I am the gap filler when it's the right stage of recovery for people to take the action with the goals that they need to take, to challenge the thoughts as they come up in real time. I can't unpack your childhood. I can't give you a meal plan. I can't give you the science behind food. I think that sometimes, we take a very all or nothing perfectionistic approach when we're thinking about treatment, when we're thinking about the space. So different things, different times, different people. Why do I keep needing others to recognize and validate my illness before I fully commit to recovery? I hate that I need people to tell me that I'm ill and that as soon as this stops happening, I think they don't care or that they don't realize I'm still struggling. Such a common barrier to getting better or going into recovery at all, because it's why 99.9% of my clients, at some point, we have to work on help seeking and see it as a skill rather than a last resort or a sign of weakness or whatever it might be. Majority of people who I see with eating disorders are not skilled or proactive help seekers. And very commonly, it's because we have been taught not to help seek, that it is pointless, that we are met with invalidation or just nothing, or worse than that, criticism for needing help or needing support. And very often that has happened in our formative years when we're very young, when we can't advocate for ourselves, when we can't see the injustice of that. So it makes complete sense that part of your eating disorders role has been to act as a spokesperson for the most vulnerable, hurt, in need part of you, in a way that kind of takes the pressure off you needing to verbally communicate to people that you need their help and you need their support. And you might instead do that through your behaviors or your body, because it's a more passive way of demonstrating that you need help, and maybe does, even though we know it is high risk, it doesn't maybe emotionally feel as risky as directly asking somebody for help. Now, that's a big part of recovery because we are herd animals. We can't do this life stuff alone. And for the really big stuff, it's important that we have help and support and community. So not only is help seeking really important through the recovery process, it is then something we have to learn to do for life and not do it perfectly. I am not a perfect help seeker. It is still not my instinct always to reach out, but I now know the red flags that I'm entering a place where I am maybe resisting help or isolating, and then I just have to opposite action it. As uncomfortable as it can be, I need to just throw myself into it because I just have too much evidence at this point that if I don't, it's going to work against me in the long run. So that's probably why it holds so much importance to you in that department, because it's a stand-in for what maybe you've been taught you're not allowed to do or can't do, or it's just pointless to do. No one's coming, right? I have experienced that at points in my life. Don't ask for help, nobody's coming. So that's very much still an internalized belief that I have that I occasionally have to work against and actively, move through and prove is wrong each and every time. So it totally makes sense. It totally makes sense why your eating disorder might be playing that role. Why do some eating disorder professionals, as with the mental health professionals in general, hold some of the most stigmatizing beliefs about eating disorders and mental health within our society? Because a lot of them are operating from a very, very traditional, in some ways, very outdated framework. That's the truth. It is in part because it is influenced by the medical field, and the medical field is famously, or I should say infamously, undertrained when it comes to eating disorders and in a lot of cases, mental health in general. And it's just not very progressive, especially when it comes to eating disorders, which is why the position of lived experience is so important, because it just totally conflicts so many of these stigmas you're talking about. So again, I think we need to think with nuance. Obviously, qualifications and professional experience and professional input and clinical input, all really important. Just as important is the feedback and the input from people with lived experience all across all kinds of experiences with eating disorders and recovery and mental health, right? That's, I think, where we're going to see the most progress, is when those two things are operating more harmoniously. Whereas that's one of my biggest gripes about operating in Australia, is the lack of collaboration across the space. And it is incredibly frustrating. Can you tell how annoying I find this? I'm being very diplomatic right now, but I find that particularly egregious in Australia. But yeah, I think that once we can get those two, or those three spheres, like professionals, clinicians, and people with lived experience, some of whom, fall across a couple of those categories. Once we can get everybody having a productive conversation, I think we'll see great progress. Is that happening right now? Not always. Why do so many recovery account holders film themselves crying and post it to social media? I just don't understand it, and I have had to unfollow almost all recovery accounts as they make me so uncomfortable. Well, I'm outing myself now. I have definitely cried on social media. I don't know that I cried a lot in my recovery videos because I haven't really watched them back in a long time. But I think we all know I have cried a lot on social media. But I get it. I do get it. I am a very emotional person. So I apologize if I've made any of you uncomfortable with my crying over the years. But I do get it. I get why that can make people feel uncomfortable. I think that other people's emotions can make us uncomfortable. I think especially when there is overlap with our own experience and our own emotion that we are also processing or going through. Like for me, it doesn't bother me to see people crying on social media. It does make me uncomfortable to see content about grief with people crying. That is a very, very tender wound. Increasingly healing. I mean, grief never totally heals, but since doing EMDR and trauma therapy, oh my gosh, like transformed my life and my mental health. But that's a really hard one for me to watch. I can't really follow grief accounts, and on TikTok, like I just have to swipe, and I feel bad because I resonate with them. I totally get it, but it's so close to the bone for me. But yeah, I mean, it can be uncomfortable. Emotions are uncomfortable. And I know that sometimes we can look at stuff online and be like, this is feeling a little bit performative. I'm not talking about recovery stuff because I don't watch recovery content, just to be clear. I only watch stuff that people send me, which is why I'm often out of the loop of what's going on. But in general, I know that sometimes it can look performative, so it can be uncomfortable for that reason. It can also be uncomfortable because it's close to maybe our own experience, or we just don't resonate with it. Maybe you're not someone who expresses themselves by crying, and so I think that's fine. I think that we really need to increasingly take the position that something can be harmless. Like, I work hard to make sure that my content is as responsible as possible, as accessible as possible for people. I also accept that it's just not gonna be everyone's thing. It's just not gonna speak to everyone. People are going to cringe at it, or it's going to make people angry, or they're not going to see themselves in it. And there's just only so much we can do to appeal to everyone and for everyone to see themselves in our content, right? It would be like saying you can be friends with every single person you meet. Well, that's the antithesis of what we actually tell people. No, you're not going to be friends with everyone, and you've got to work on being okay with that. So we've got to work on being okay with content just not being for us, or not being for us right now, or that person just not being our person, without attaching anything more to it than incompatibility. So I think that's fine. You're allowed to have that reaction. Just it's not for you. See it as an opportunity rather than maybe an annoyance, right? There are so many more, but this will be like 40 minutes long, and then everyone will click off halfway through, whereas I can probably just make a more entertaining part 2 out of it than making it a feature film. But I hope that answers some of your controversial questions that maybe you've had in mind but have not wanted to ask, or whatever. I really like having these conversations. I think in order for us to make progress personally and more broadly, we need to be able to have uncomfortable conversations. So I, as always, want to hear your thoughts below. And yeah, I'll probably do a part 2 out of this next week. Really good stuff coming up on the podcast as well, so keep an eye out for that. Thank you so much for supporting the podcast. We love doing it. Come and join us for the Body Neutrality Workshop. There's still a few tickets left to that. That's a week together working on actual practical skills and tools for body image, not just talking about it, but actually getting you to better outcomes with body image and making the recovery process more manageable, tolerable, and working towards a place where you can find more acceptance, peace, whatever it is you're looking for in that relationship with body image. So much love. Take care. I'll see you next week. Bye, guys.